From the BBC World Service, welcome to the latest edition of the Documentary Podcast. Every week we bring you a range of stories from our presenters and reporters across the world. Please do rate the documentary on your podcast app and leave a comment. Let us know what you think.
For 30 years, a sectarian conflict raged in Northern Ireland. More than 3,600 people lost their lives. Scores of thousands were injured. The British government sent in troops in 1969 in an attempt to maintain order among Protestant and Catholic communities who appeared unable to live side by side.
That looks like a petrol bomb over there, flashing its way across.
The role of Catholic clergy during the Troubles is well documented. It was not without controversy. A small number were seen as active supporters of IRA violence. But the bigger story is one of huge risk-taking in the cause of peace. Priests spoke out on behalf of their communities, officiated at far too many funerals. Some put their lives on the line, acting as intermediaries between government and men of violence. There is another story that is less well known, and that's the story of Catholic nuns. You might find a mention of us in the index of a book, but rarely within its chapters. And that's where the witness seminars come in.
Hello, Marie. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Very well, thanks. How's you? Good. Did you come over today?
Over a period of 2 years, Roman Catholic sisters gathered together to share our memories of 30 years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The witness seminars, as we call them, were initiated by an independent scholar, Dr. Diane Kirby, and Lisa Isherwood, Professor of Feminist Liberation Theology at the University of Winchester. There was no plan. We simply spoke about the experiences that stood out. Now, some of us are getting together again with producer Rosie Dawson and sound recordist John Benson. I'm a Dominican sister, Geraldine Smith, and this, for the documentary on BBC World Service, is Sisters of the Troubles.
I'm going to start with number one. So, yes, just give me a few words. Tell me.
Oh, hello. Nice to meet you, John.
Okay.
I'm from Hartlepool.
A little bit more from Diane?
Yes, just a little more.
Hartlepool's sort of like the Costa Brava of the North East Coast.
Oh, go away. No, it's not.
So we're all together again, and I'm wondering whether some people are feeling a bit nervous, as we did when we first gathered in February 2015.
I'm Mary Delargy, I'm a Mercy sister. I felt a certain amount of resistance about it, maybe a wee bit suspicious to what is this, who's involved, where's it all going to go? And I took time before I decided, even coming here today, I took time before I said yes to you, Rosie. There was just that sense of not wanting to revisit some of the stuff of years and years ago, but I'm here.
I'm Liz, I'm a Dominican sister. There's a phrase in Belfast that I grew up with was, whatever you say nothing. But I think there's a certain anxiety, and there was a certain anxiety, and there's still a certain anxiety that it could have repercussions for other people.
I'm Kathleen Keane, Little Company of Mary's sister. I was delighted because I'm aware that women's voices are missing all over the place, and that they're actually disappearing as well now in religious life because we're ageing and we're dying off, and the stories go with us.
It's important to stress that the conflict in Northern Ireland was political, not religious. The government's response to a civil rights movement in the late 60s acted as a catalyst for further unrest. A peaceful campaign by nationalists for equality in housing, jobs and electoral politics was met with official opposition and at times with brutality. There was widespread unrest. At the same time, paramilitaries were also arming. British soldiers arrived on the streets in 1969, and later the London government imposed direct rule.
I was at Queen's when that was really kicking off. It was a difficult time to be a student. It wasn't a normal time. And there was a riot up at Burntollet outside Derry, and the university polarised immediately the next day. You were actually afraid to go down into your class. You didn't know who you were talking to, and you wanted to know who was Protestant, who was Catholic. So the whole thing was kind of galvanising the university into a great deal of tension and fear. And yet I was going backwards to my community in Downpatrick, 20 miles away. And while there were things convulsing in Belfast, there I was being told by the superior, don't talk about anything up there, don't talk about the troubles. I don't want the sisters disturbed. So you were going from Belfast down to Downpatrick, 20 miles away, and you were living in a sort of schizoid situation where you couldn't talk about what was going on in Belfast, but you were going backwards and forwards as a student and, trying to manage studies and meeting sometimes Protestants in your class. I did Hebrew, and that brought me into contact with all the Protestant ministers at the time, which was fascinating. And they were equally fascinated with me because I was in a habit in those days. Mm-hmm. And they were full of curiosity about the likes of me appearing in a Hebrew class. So there was lots of kind of curiosity things, but also times of great tension when you were trying to figure out what was going on, and you could feel that things were beginning to change and that Catholics were finding their voice, and it was not going to be the same.
And this is where it all started. And on the 21st of August 1969, there was 500 families were burnt out of their homes. Catholics had to leave Protestant areas, and Protestants had to leave Catholic areas. The peace wall to our left.
I'm Marie. I'm Sister of the Cross and Passion. I was about 15, I think, in 1969. And my first memory of the Troubles, really, had to do with rioting and the burning of houses in the Lower Falls, which is a Catholic area. And people were burnt out of their homes. And up came two friends of my mother's at 4 o'clock in the morning. She opened the door to her friend and her husband and the baby in her arms. And that's my first memory of the Troubles.
Yeah, my earliest memory, or what I've been told, I often don't know whether it's my actual memory or I've been told it, but it's part of our thing, is when we were burnt out in 1969 as a family down in the Lower Falls. I would have been 4. And I do remember after that we had to leave home. We lost our home, we lost everything. And it caused my mother to be very stressed. And then I suppose the next big thing in my life that I really do remember was when I lived with my granny, seeing tear gas and seeing men, well, soldiers, and people running around with guns and having gas masks and having hankies over our mouths.
The street we were in was barricaded, like all the streets onto the Falls Road. And the men in the street all manned the barricades. And the people like myself, the young teenagers, we had to bring up the soup and the sandwiches and the tea and all the rest of it. It was nearly like a community spirit, really, if it wasn't so sad, But
I remember a common friend of ours, Alan. Alan talks about the same thing happening on the Shankill side, and they had a tidy barricades competition. And he said we were gutted when we didn't win.
But I had the sense that these men were all there to protect us. I didn't really understand what they were protecting us from, but I did know that there was a lot of rioting and a lot of burning, a lot to be afraid of. And I certainly was afraid. But we didn't talk about it, We didn't go anywhere either because you couldn't, it was too scary. But at night we had sing-songs, and we sang all the kind of songs of the day, pop songs. And when we ran out of pop songs, we would sing hymns. And then we'd run out of hymns and we'd sing rebel songs. And by the end of these rebel songs, we were actually shouting them and, really getting into them. So that's how we spent our evenings.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see till the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up in the zoo. And says I, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army.
And my mother and father always went out for a walk, just round the street. And my dad would come in and say, will you shut up? The soldiers are standing at the top of the street and, you know, you get all this and they'll hear you and you're like a cat's chorus. So there was actually, you could have fun in the middle of it.
Looking for monkeys up in the zoo at the time I had a face like you would. The British Army.
I suppose it's like everything, you know, when you're grown up, it's where you live, you think it's normal. You don't actually realise that this is abnormal. So you get part of the hype that's going around. So growing up, I suppose, when there was riots going on the road, we got involved in the riots, you know, you threw stones, you called people's names, you grew up believing that one group of people were very different from the other. And then, unfortunately, some people then were driven to another road, which, thank God, each day that I didn't take that road, that I was lucky to have met people and to have known that taking someone's life is not the right way. And that's where I see that the sisters had a role to play for me.
I'm Diane Kirby, an academic rather than a sister. I remember, Liz, you talking about the fact that you were determined to minister to children and give them a good education because that's what you received and that's what opened and widened your horizons as a child growing up in Belfast.
For me growing up, there was 3 ways you could make a difference. One was you could join the IRA and make a difference. The other was you could join the police and make a difference. And the third was you could join a religious order and make a difference, because I had seen sisters make a difference in our lives. I went to St. Rose's Secondary School in Beachmount Avenue, and in that I now realise that there was a Dominican thing, and that Dominican thing was that everybody is good, that everybody has the right to do well, and that everybody's needs can be met, and education is the key. And I think some of the sisters who told me that education is what would make the difference. So I joined the Dominicans because I believed that they had used the weapon of education rather than the gun to make a difference.
You're listening to The Documentary on BBC World Service. I'm Geraldine Smith and I'm recalling, along with my fellow Catholic sisters, what life was like during the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
I now want you to look down the next street and we're going to see some of the black and white murals for the 10 men that died on hunger strike in the Maze prison. That is Bobby Sands. He was the first hunger striker to die. He was 27 years of age.
In the early 1980s, Republican prisoners went on hunger strike over the British government's refusal to allow them the status of political prisoners. It was a traumatic time for the Catholic community. Many of the participants in the witness seminars were deeply affected.
When Bobby Sands was the first person to be on hunger strike, nobody ever thought that they would let this person die.
This is Sheila Curran from the Congregation of the Sisters of Mercy.
Everybody's talk around, the housing estate that I grew up in would have been kept saying, there's no way they're going to let him die. There's no way, and every time then people say if he dies, it's going to be really serious. We were all talking, like it was every day you were waking up, what was happening. Everybody was listening to the news. Like it was the countdown as he was seriously ill. And when he died, I will never forget getting up the next day and there were black flags, so many black flags. So there was a fear, there was a really tangible fear, like what's going to happen next? What's going to happen because he has died, the volatility of the violence that will escalate from that, how many more were going to die, and as we know, a lot more died. So for me, it was, I suppose, the moment that politicised me, that these issues were not just that they affected everybody's life.
In the last hour, the news has filtered through to this community that Bobby Sands has died after 66 days of hunger strike. And the Northern Ireland office in the last hour has issued a terse one-line statement. Mr. Robert Sands, a prisoner in the Maze prison, died today at 1:17. He took his own life by refusing food and medical intervention.
Thousands watched as the hearse started out on its 4-mile journey to Milltown Cemetery. West Belfast had closed down for the day, and the security presence.
I'm Lisa Isherwood, Professor of Feminist Liberation Theology, based at the University of Winchester. What struck me during the seminars was how much time and how much emotion was spent on the hunger strikes. I'm wondering how people understood that in religious terms.
I think religious language was rife of different kinds of grammar. I think within the Republican community in prison who had espoused this, I think some of them were very deeply compelled and impelled by their faith conviction. So we had language of martyrdom, we had murals going on walls with religious iconography of rosary beads and the Virgin Mary. And I think while I might not find any resonance with that in terms of my own faith understanding about death and martyrdom, I think martyrdom is about witnessing with your life and not just with your death. At the same time, I think nobody would have doubted the deep faith motivation on the part of the people who actually saw themselves as laying down their lives for the sake of their people. So that kind of language would have been going on inside the nationalist Republican community and among the prisoners themselves. I think there would have been other Catholics and Protestants looking on who would have seen this as playing fast and loose with the God-given gift of human life. And I know that touches into many raw nerves, even in retrospect.
I lived with a cousin who was in my community, who was a cousin of Bobby Sands, which made living in community around all of that extremely fraught. You couldn't talk about it, or else there was going to be nearly World War III. We had other sisters who had relations in the British Army, and there was all that spectrum in between. I'd been in London and I came home to Andersonstown just at the time Joe MacDonald died. He was one of the hunger strikers. And the whole atmosphere around the place, it was really, really dark. And I was actually in the house as the funeral cortege came past. And I remember seeing the people being pushed into the middle of the road by Saracen cars all gathered round. And I remember the sense of rage that I felt. And I thought, if I had a gun, I would have wanted to use it. And it stayed with me so long. It was like I knew from that point on I was capable of murder. But there was a huge amount of confusion as you felt that, thinking, well, a nun shouldn't feel like this, I shouldn't be like that. But you were conscious of feeling very, I don't know what the word is, confused and angry and frustrated. I didn't feel I had a voice at that time. I couldn't say that to anybody. I couldn't share about it in community. I don't know what I did with it, but I was very conscious that sometime later I then did find my voice and then was able to talk about how I felt. But there was a sense of guilt too. You're a nun, you shouldn't be talking like this, So it was difficult to be a religious and to live through this because it wasn't the way you were supposed to be as a Christian, as a Catholic, as a religious. And here you were, seeing the people being, kind of corralled and pushed and shoved, and there was nothing. I felt so powerless, I couldn't describe how I felt.
And also isolated, because you're saying you couldn't talk about it within your order.
No, even when there were 2 soldiers that were beaten up and murdered by a crowd, and I came through the town that day, could sense again this very heavy atmosphere, got to the house, somebody said, oh, did you hear what happened? What happened? 2 soldiers were murdered. And again, I couldn't say it because of the dynamic in the community. But that night, an English priest that I knew phoned me. And it was only to him that I could say how ashamed I felt about the way these men had been treated by a crowd of other men. And it was so shocking. And yet, in the very house that you were saying that you were living, supposed to be your home, you couldn't say it.
I think it brings home the complexity of what people were holding, including sisters, and the fact that the spectrum of ideologies, of outlooks and interpretations of what was going on, even in a community of 10 people or in a family, was very wide and at deep tension points like that. It really demanded a lot of repression. And I come back to the trauma. Marie, I think you would have a lot of experience to share about that.
Well, I was just listening to Mary there, I had quite a similar experience. In 1987, a friend of mine was murdered in front of his wife and children, and it was quite horrific. And I had never experienced this kind of anger before. I actually wanted access to a gun at one point, and I thought, if only I knew who these people were. I was angry and expected the same feelings from my friend, but she seemed to have more spiritualized the whole experience and believed that God would bring some good out of this horrible murder. And I could not connect to any spirituality or God, only my anger. It did have a tremendous effect on the rest of my life. It does something to you, I think, when you realise the depth of your own anger and your own capacity to do something to somebody else, you know. It kind of opens you up to greater empathy, I think. You can't sit in judgment as easily as you did, you know, the day before.
Right.
And I experienced that kind of conflict within myself to the point of having to leave the situation. A personal crisis, really.
Do you think this was a crisis of faith?
Most definitely a crisis of faith. I suppose I believed that God could end this violence if God so wished. Magical kind of thinking, but it's totally put me into a crisis of faith, because here was I, the nun, supposed to be the kind of professional spiritual guide or whatever, really at sea when it came to my faith. And I went and sought help, really, because being a religious, there were expectations that I wasn't living up to, nor did I want to.
Can I just say that, because we discussed this, didn't we, about this sense that if you're a sister, you should forgive.
Yes, many people feel the burden of Christianity, if you like, on their shoulders to do so. And some people can say it quickly and mean it, of course. But I sometimes question that sometimes forgiveness comes too soon. People think that it's a one-off gesture that you make, when in actual fact it's a hard day-to-day decision. Not everybody can do it.
In the first half of the programme, we heard about some of the struggles and dilemmas facing Catholic nuns during 30 years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Some of the most challenging situations were faced by those living on the so-called peace line, which divided Catholic and Protestant communities in Belfast. Sister Kathleen Keane now lives in Dublin, but she took the programme's producer, Rosie Dawson, back to see her old home.
So we're on Springfield Road now. This is the biggest transformation. This barrier that you can see through, it looks quite normal almost.
Because it used to be a solid wall.
It was solid metal. I suppose it had to be armour-proof, you know. And it's attached onto my house, number 369 Springfield Road. And then on the other side of this semi-detached, these two houses, it continues on.
It's a funny word for it, isn't it? Peace line.
Yes, but it looks more like a peace line now than it did.
What was the purpose of it?
The purpose of the peace line? Well, my neighbour, Paddy, had a very simple explanation. When this young woman asked him one day, "What's that wall for?" And he said, "That's because two lots of Christians can't live with each other."
But you still can't drive through here.
Oh no, this barrier is never opened except twice a year for the march. On the last Saturday in June and on the 12th of July, to allow for the local Orange March, which would be on its way to the celebrations downtown. Oh, we're passing by my house, and it's all being done up very beautifully, and it's such transformation, because the last time I was here it was derelict and the gardens were overgrown and everything, so I'm delighted that it hasn't been demolished.
Do you want to see inside?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Great. Oh, wow. This was the kitchen. This was where the people would come and knock on the door and say, can I go through? Now, they would be desperately stuck usually, they'd be either in a hurry or going somewhere, and it was a long walk around. They'd really be stuck if you couldn't get access to Springfield Road. So they'd just knock on the back door here, my kitchen door. They'd walk through here and out the front door. It's a nice day today, thank you. And away they went. I had a little cat whose dish was there, and the youngsters next door had put a little plastic Union Jack, and they stuck it on the wall over the cat's dish, because they said she came from the Shankill, so she's a Protestant cat, so it's a Union Jack. Can we go upstairs? This was my bedroom, and I had my bed there. When things went bang in the middle of the night, I jumped out of the bed, of course, and I could look out that landing window, and I had to know, usually it was just stones or something, which way they came. So now we've turned into Workman Avenue, which is effectively a cul-de-sac because of the barrier, and we're walking along my side fence of my back garden, and the first two houses that we come, number 2 and number 4, are the Curragh community, which were established by a Dominican sister and a priest as an interfaith community in the late 80s. And it's been here ever since. There are 2 sisters living here now. Sister Gillian said she'd be here to let us in.
Oh, hello, Kathleen. How are you?
Well, Gillian, it's great to see you
Yes.
here.
Hello, Rosie.
Hi.
Yes, do go in. Well, where shall we sit? I'm going to ring Pam to see if she can come over.
Pam Kane. That would be lovely.
Oh, Kathleen, for goodness sake, how are you?
On a crutch, Pam.
Oh, hi.
Lovely
What
to
a lovely
see
treat.
you.
It's lovely to see you, honestly. Every time I walk past the house, I think about you. And have you seen the houses? Aren't they lovely?
It's great, isn't it?
Aren't they lovely? They're really lovely. Hiya, and Pam.
I'm Rosie. I'm producing a programme. I'll tell you all about it.
Right. I'll just take my coat off. Right, yeah.
Pam, what did you think of Kathleen when she rocked up here?
Well, it's just another sister. Sorry, I'm saying that from a Protestant perspective,
Sure.
It was an amazing thing to happen at the time, that the nuns were living on the Protestant side of the fence. It really was, really. And the group we had in this, in this conservatory, people had to stand, sit on floors, sit on the cushions. Do you remember there was that many offices?
And they enjoyed each other so much, didn't they?
Just lined with chairs, just those chairs,
That's right.
Gillian. And the younger ones got on the floor and sat on the floor.
Yeah.
But it was always full house. And
What was going on in those meetings?
Friendship.
everything and anything.
Craft.
Main thing, friendship.
Tea, talk.
Half of us would have been from one side of the fence and half of us from the other. So this was a very neutral. And at that time, it was still quite difficult. There was still terrible things happening here. There was a policewoman in here one day doing a sort of a seminar with some of the local ladies. And there was a rocket fired in here.
Yeah.
So as a group, we nursed many as a person through awful tragedies and awful events, on both sides. So it was just an amazing space to be able to come to that was just literally round the corner.
You heard Kathleen talking a few minutes ago about the marching season. Parades and marches are very much part of Northern Ireland's Protestant culture, but they are also controversial because they commemorate Protestant victories over Catholics. The vast majority of parades are uncontentious, but some either pass or go through Catholic areas, sparking the potential for violence. It made life very difficult for people on the peace line, like Anne Kilroy, a Loreto sister.
The reason I came back to Belfast was to live on the peace line in an ecumenical community called Cornerstone Community. Cornerstone had been involved in extraordinary work, visiting bereaved people on both sides of the community together. And my order were quite happy that I would live in an ecumenical community. In fact, I was the only Catholic living in at that stage. And Kathleen lived down the road as well. They were extraordinary years, really. But one of the big issues at the time was the marching season. And it was very, traumatic every time it came to it. So one particular year it was suggested that a group of us would negotiate between the Protestant Unionist Orange Order and the local residents, namely the Republican end of things. But our negotiations backfired because a piece of graffiti, well, a very large piece written right across the wall of the local school, then summed it all up for us, and it was the unholy trinity. The Orange Order, the RUC, namely the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the Cornerstone community versus the residents. And that was such a slap in the face because we were trying to be neutral. We were praying in Cornerstone as we always did on the 12th of July. And we could hear the drumming coming and the march coming, and we felt this is really dangerous. And when we came out, there were the very people we had tried to mediate with. And I recognised one of the men across there, and I shouted across, and he said, "What are you doing on the other side?" Finally then, we walked down to Kathleen's place. I think you were away, Kathleen, at the time. And Mary and I don't know if you remember this, were watching from the top window as all the young people gathered to have a further riot later on. So I'm looking out the top window. I can't go out there because I'm now the enemy.
I'm Sister Geraldine Smith. You're listening to the World Service documentary about the lives of Catholic religious sisters during Northern Ireland's Troubles. Protestant women weren't the focus of the original witness seminars. That may yet be a whole other project. But as we've seen, they were also active in the work of peace and reconciliation. We wanted you to hear from two of them, May, now Baroness Blood, who lived and worked on the peace line, and Presbyterian minister Leslie Carroll.
Leigh, it's really great to see you.
Hello, Journey. Good to see you.
Thank you. Sister Sheila Curran.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Well-known union activist.
May and I wonder how long we're here for.
I worked on the peace line with Catholic women and Protestant women, but was conscious of what the religious sisters were trying to do, seen them often. But in my community, that never came to the fore, never. I mean, if I had said we were going to meet a group of Catholic women, that was all right. But if I had said then we're going to meet a group of Catholic nuns, I wouldn't have had anybody going. Because there was that perception that they were somehow different.
Personally speaking, I would have had contact with the sisters through organisations like Pax Christi and some other peace groups, which were reflecting really from a faith perspective on what was happening. I mean, it's interesting, I suppose, even in the church, it would be the same story, that there would have been no talk about Catholic sisters at all. It was always about the priest. So, I mean, I apologise to my sisters that they were so many times made invisible.
Yes, I suppose that would have been the perception back when the trouble started. Most people thought nuns just lived in convents and were very rarely let out. Now, I knew that not to be true, but that's what the perception of the Protestant, and the other perception that most Protestant women would have had was they had to do what the priest told them.
Absolutely.
So therefore,
that's the bit.
They didn't come into the thinking.
But I think when they began to meet real religious sisters, they discovered that nothing could be further from the truth.
I agree with Geraldine there, because I remember working with some Christian sisters on the Falls Road. They had a particular problem around teenage pregnancy. So had we within the Protestant community. And so they contacted me to see could we come to some kind of a joint solution. Now I started to work there. And when I went back and told the group that had been on the Falls and was talking to Christian sisters, they looked at me as if it grew horns. You know, what would you be going over there for? That was the attitude. But, Sterling says there's women on both sides have always worked through those issues. Although I have to say at one time it was pretty dangerous. Mm-hmm. You know, if it had been well known that, for instance, I was down in St Dominic's on the Falls, that had been public knowledge, well, I would have had to suffer for that at home.
In what way?
Well, in a number of ways. The loyalist paramilitaries have letting you know they're not pleased with what you're doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had my car wrecked several times, I had my life threatened, things like that.
I'm Lisa Isherwood. We've heard from some of the sisters how their experiences made them struggle with their faith and actually question it quite deeply. And I'm wondering if for the Protestant women this was the same experience. Did it make you question religion at any point?
No, that would never cross my mind. I mean, yes, in personal situations where you have things happening in your own family, you'd incline to say, well, how could God be in the middle of this? But I would say on the broader picture of Northern Ireland, I've never questioned it. I do think there is a plan out there. I think we just have to keep working on it. And I think eventually, maybe not be in my lifetime, but eventually we will come to that. Because I think there's so many good people out there, people of faith and people of no faith. I think eventually it has to work out the way God planned it. Maybe we have to go through this wilderness. Maybe that's where we are. Maybe that's why myself as a Protestant woman was put on the peace line. I was burned out of my home by Protestants and had to move to the peace line. And maybe that's just part of God's plan, but I would never question God's hand in it, never. On a political level, I never asked where God was in, because I always believed that God was in each one of us, and each one of us was making our little small contribution to the actual solution of the problem. So therefore I didn't question it at all.
I just envy May, that absolute kind of trust that you have, May. Nevertheless, watching in that kind of pastoral role over people and hearing them longing for peace, praying for peace, working for peace, and then something terrible would happen, and then they come back to prayer and the whole struggle of their lives, and kind of watching over that. What I often found was that I would swing into the extremity of my own background, if you like. So I'm from a very traditional evangelical Christian background, and for me the extremity would have been to swing into the God who rescues, rather than the God who is part of, or however you want to describe it. So I would have swung into that, where are you, God, that you haven't come to rescue us here? And the corrective for me was often found in my conversations with Catholic sisters.
Yeah, I was very fascinated, really, that the sisters offered a corrective to this rescue God, to the God who sits apart from the struggle and may or may not lift people out of it and save them. And I think perhaps this was an influence from sisters coming back from Latin America, where there was a model developing of liberation theology, in which this God is the struggle. God is within not only the person, but within the struggle. And this was actually growing in Latin America. And it seems to me that from some of the stories that we're hearing, that it may have been taking seed in Northern Ireland as well during this time.
Well, Leslie, like in terms of Roman Catholic women, and as a woman religious within the structure of my church, it's so hierarchical, and we're not in the decision-making of the institutionalised structure of church in the same way as it would be in your tradition. Can you please say a bit more about what it is like to be a woman within a structure of a church that from the outside give the appearance that women have a more equal say?
Okay, sure.
Say something on that?
And I mean, I'm glad you said from the outside in, because from the inside out, it doesn't always feel the same. I suppose, Sheila, there are times when we look at you and think, haven't Catholic nuns great freedom? But someone like myself can sit on some of the senior committees of the church, and from time to time, the church does realise that it needs a female voice and will ask for that. But, I've had that privilege of sitting on what would have been the Church and Government Committee at the time, coming up to the Good Friday Agreement, and meeting with politicians and leaders and all that kind of thing outside the church. So I think as a woman in Presbyterianism, I have had a voice, but I know that not every woman feels that.
Agreement. The impossible was done late this afternoon. And in the end, after 36 hours of non-stop, no sleep, all night and day negotiation, it was as close a call as...
That the agreement bringing peace to Northern Ireland fell on Good Friday was down to a missed deadline. United States Senator George Mitchell had said that the power-sharing talks he was chairing must conclude by midnight on the 9th of April 1998. It was more than 17 hours after that the historic deal was struck.
This agreement is good for the people of Ireland, North and South. It was made possible...
But I want to say this to the politicians and to the people of Northern Ireland with all the force that I can muster. Even now, this will not work unless in your will and in your mind you make it work.
The cross is a symbol of suffering, but also of hope. As their politicians laboured to produce an agreement, the people of the Ormeau Road, Protestant and Catholic, held an Easter vigil. In this area, so often the scene of confrontation in the marching season, they prayed together for a new, peaceful future.
It was a long week, and all-nighters and all that kind of thing. And when it was announced, there was euphoria, because I have to tell you, nobody actually thought it was going to come about.
Yeah.
When it was announced in the middle of the night, and George Mitchell must take a lot of praise for it, when it was announced, I think people were so stunned they couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe that there was possibly we were going to have an agreement.
I remember it was snowing, May.
Yeah, I remember
that. I also remember, like May said, that we didn't really think it was going to happen. So it was absolutely mind-blowing that it had. And talk about something lifted your spirits. I mean, it was amazing.
At that stage, it was called the Good Friday Agreement. Not necessarily because it fell on Good Friday, but it did. But for me, it's always been a Good Friday. And I know Protestants now call it the Belfast Agreement. That's a lot of nonsense. It was a Good Friday. The agreement's had a lot of things it hasn't fulfilled, but the one thing, the Good Friday Agreement, and nobody can dispute this, it brought peace. It brought peace to this part of the world, which I absolutely never thought would happen.
I think that for the Good Friday Agreement to work, there had to be a substantial network of all sorts of relationships, up, down, across, diagonally across society. And I think that the politicians have never understood the importance of that network of relationships. And that had to be there to get it over the line. But without that vast network of which women were a part, not the only part, but of which women were a part, I don't think it would have happened.
Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Keep on walking, keep on talking, gonna build a brand new world.
One of the people I came across going to a seminar was by John Paul Lederach, who was a Mennonite, and he was giving us a framework in which to understand what was going on. He used the idea of a triangle where you had the top end of the apex, who were the people who were involved at political level, government level. You had the grassroots of people in the, if you like, the different communities there at neighbourhood level. And then you had a vast group in the middle who were, as he put it, were the people who in fact stopped this place from descending into total civil war. And I believe that as religious, that somehow or other we were part of all of that section, doing our little bit here, there and everywhere to bring some kind of peace, some kind of meaning, some kind of presence that was calming, that was compassionate, that was struggling with, even when we didn't have words for it. We were there with the people.
Keep on talking, keep on singing, keep on swinging, gonna build a brand new world.
We weren't making the headlines during the Troubles. We were, as Mary says, simply there with people, doing whatever it was we felt called to do. Why was it important then for us to hold these witness seminars all these years later? Why do we need to share our stories with you now?
We didn't do anything, we were just sisters, we were just doing what we meant to do. And I think for me that was the key, because often people are just doing what they're meant to do and not realising the influence that they have. And I think that is important, that the sisters would stay, that they would be there. And the witness seminar made me stop and think that really people, by their everyday actions, make a difference.
Can I just say that I think the point that Liz is making there, which is really important, when we set off, I think the sisters just really wanted to say, well, we were just doing our jobs. And Liz was actually a catalyst, because she didn't want to talk about herself. She was there to talk about the sisters that had brought her up and made all that difference to her life. So she got very passionate and was the one who actually established what these women did was very important, and it made a difference. I remember you saying it made a difference, and the people of my generation know they made a difference.
A few years ago, 2 sisters from my order were killed in a road crash outside Belfast, and it brought thousands of people out onto the street to mourn their passing. Frances had been the principal of a local primary school for 40 years. She knew everybody all around Ardoyne. She'd been there through all the troubles and had been with people. Mary worked in Jewish-Christian relations, and you had the 2 of them in the one community, and the fact that it brought so many people out on the street, I think in a way typified the presence of sisters. It gave people a way of expressing how they felt about the role of sisters here in the north that hadn't got the political and sectarian kind of overtones. And when the funeral cortege was passing Tweddell Avenue, which was still a focal point of protest at the time, the Orange men actually saluted the coffins and lowered the flags.
The witness seminars has involved people in telling their story, in remembering as a form of healing. And really that was an opportunity that wasn't really afforded us in any way. And the witness seminars, therefore, it was cathartic in the sense that I was able to talk about things in a safe environment where you weren't going to be judged, you know, that you could actually say how it was for you. And it makes me feel a little bit more equal to everybody else, so that I'm not just the helper, I am also the one in need of help.
What's amazed me is just how you just put your bodies on the line time and time again. You didn't see anything extraordinary in that. You were simply saying you had to turn up, you had to show a commitment to your community, and that this commitment was actually your understanding of the heart of your religious commitment.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier how difficult it was in our communities to talk about anything in relation to the Troubles. When I heard a sister from my own community who I'd lived with, who I'd taught with in a school, talk about the trauma that had gone on in her family, and I knew absolutely nothing about it. And then, you know, realising that we could live together in community and not know what each other was carrying, and listening to all the other sisters. In a way, I marvelled at what had been going on. There was so much of it that was invisible. And yet, the witness seminars gave us the opportunity to name it and to own it, which none of us, at least I certainly hadn't been able to do before. So there was a sense in which it was liberating. Thank you.
Thank you.
A well-known theologian once spoke of religious orders as carrying the dangerous memory of the Church. And I think we recalled dangerous memories in our meetings. We'd travelled together in many coalitions and alliances with other women. We'd crossed lines all over in the kinds of work we've done. We'd stood at Catholic funerals and Protestant funerals. We'd held hands at peace rallies. But there was something unique about coming together as Catholic sisters to reflect on what we'd journeyed through in the light of our Christian faith that was challenged, that was sometimes lost, was found again and renewed. 20 years on, we are still here, and I feel a great sense of gratitude for that. And all this is what I take away from the witness seminars. You've been listening to Sisters of the Troubles on the World Service, presented by me, Sister Geraldine Smith. The producer was Rosie Dawson.
Thanks for listening. We'll have more for you soon, and please do subscribe. The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from.
Hello, I'm Carrie Gracie, and until recently I was the BBC's China editor. Well, I've got something really exciting to tell you. I'm now presenting the Real Story podcast. It's also made by the BBC World Service. We take a single topic in and around the news and we examine it in depth, 1 hour, one topic every week. The idea is to give important issues just that bit more space to breathe. So if you're looking for a slower look at our fast-changing world, search for The Real Story wherever you find your podcasts.